December 1914. Soldiers who'd been trying to kill each other for months suddenly stopped fighting, climbed out of their trenches and played soccer together in no man's land, and their officers were furious about it. The Christmas Truce is one of the strangest events in World War I, because for a brief moment, soldiers on both sides decided the war could wait. They sang carols, exchanged gifts, buried their dead, and treated each other like human beings instead of enemies. And it happened naturally, without orders from above, which is exactly why it never happened again. This is the story of what happened during Christmas 1914, why it matters, and why the people in charge made sure it would never be repeated. Because understanding the Christmas Truce shows you the difference between the people fighting the war and the people running it. By December 1914, World War I had been going on for about 4 months. And it wasn't going the way anyone expected. Everyone thought it would be a quick war, over by Christmas. That's what the politicians promised, what the generals believed, what the soldiers expected when they signed up. The phrase, home by Christmas, was repeated everywhere in August 1914 when the war started. Politicians used it to sell the war to the public. Generals believed it because their war plans assumed quick victories. Young men enlisted expecting a short adventure, a chance to see action and be home in time for Christmas dinner with their families. But it didn't work out that way. The German advance through Belgium and France had been stopped. The Allies had tried to push the Germans back and failed. Both sides had tried to outflank each other, racing north toward the English Channel, but that hadn't worked either. By November 1914, the front lines had solidified into a continuous line of trenches running from the Swiss border to the North Sea. The race to the sea, as it was called, ended with both sides digging in. What had been a war of movement became a war of position. Neither side could break through the other's lines. Neither side could outflank the other because there were no flanks anymore. Just a continuous front stretching hundreds of miles. And the trenches were horrible. They were muddy ditches that filled with water when it rained. Soldiers stood in cold water for days, their feet rotting from constant moisture. Rats were everywhere, feeding on garbage and bodies. The smell was terrible. The living conditions were miserable, and people were dying constantly from artillery, snipers, disease, and random accidents. Trench foot was a major problem. Your feet would be wet constantly, for days or weeks. The skin would break down, become infected, turn black. In severe cases, toes or entire feet would have to be amputated. Thousands of soldiers became casualties from trench foot alone, never having been shot by the enemy. The trenches were supposed to be temporary, just a place to shelter while planning the next offensive. But they became permanent. Soldiers dug deeper, built more elaborate defenses, settled in for what was clearly going to be a long war. The trenches had dugouts where soldiers could sleep, command posts, supply areas, latrines. They became underground cities. The fighting in those first months had been brutal. The Battle of the Marne, the First Battle of Ypres, these were massive battles with enormous casualties. Hundreds of thousands of men had been killed or wounded. Units that went into battle at full strength came out decimated. The reality of modern warfare, with machine guns and artillery, was far worse than anyone had imagined. The Battle of the Marne in September had stopped the German advance toward Paris but cost both sides over 500,000 casualties. The First Battle of Ypres in October and November had been a desperate fight where the British and French barely held the line against German attacks, with another 250,000 casualties. 4 months of war had already produced casualties that exceeded entire previous wars. Soldiers on both sides were exhausted, cold, and increasingly disillusioned. This wasn't the glorious war they'd been promised. It was miserable survival in muddy holes, punctuated by moments of terror when they had to go over the top and attack across open ground toward enemy machine guns. The propaganda had promised adventure and glory. Posters showed heroic soldiers charging forward, flags waving, defeating cowardly enemies. The reality was mud, cold, fear, watching friends die randomly from artillery shells you never saw coming, or getting shot by snipers while you were trying to eat or sleep or take a shit. The contrast between expectation and reality was crushing. The British soldiers in the trenches were a mix of professional soldiers, reservists, and volunteers. Many had joined up in August when war was declared, swept up in patriotic enthusiasm. They'd expected adventure and glory. Instead, they got mud, death, and the grinding realization that this war wasn't going to end quickly. The British Expeditionary Force that went to France in August 1914 was a small professional army, maybe 80,000 men. They'd fought well, but taken heavy casualties. By December, many of the original soldiers were dead or wounded. Replacements were arriving, volunteers who'd signed up in the first wave of enthusiasm. These new soldiers were less experienced, less trained, and often shocked by what they found when they reached the front. The German soldiers were in similar conditions. They'd also expected a quick victory. The German war plan had been to sweep through Belgium, defeat France in 6 weeks, then turn east to deal with Russia. It hadn't worked. Now they were stuck in trenches facing an enemy that wouldn't break, fighting a war that had no end in sight. The Schlieffen Plan, Germany's strategy for a quick victory, had failed. They'd gotten close to Paris but been pushed back. Now they were holding defensive positions in France and Belgium, occupying foreign territory but unable to advance further. German soldiers had been told they were liberating Europe from French and Russian aggression. Instead, they were stuck in trenches being shot at by enemies who clearly didn't want to be liberated. The French soldiers had the additional burden of fighting on their own soil. Their country was invaded, their cities and farms occupied by the enemy. This gave them strong motivation to fight, but it also made the war more personal and painful. They were defending their homes, and they were losing. French civilians in occupied territories were living under German military rule. Stories of German atrocities, some true and some exaggerated, circulated among French soldiers. This made it harder for French troops to feel sympathetic toward German soldiers. They were defending their homeland against invaders, who'd killed French civilians and destroyed French towns. So that's the situation as Christmas 1914 approached. Exhausted, disillusioned soldiers sitting in frozen trenches, killing each other when ordered to, surviving a war that had already gone on longer than expected and showed no signs of ending. The weather in December was cold and wet. Belgium and northern France in winter are miserable. Rain turned the trenches into rivers of mud. Frost made everything hard and sharp. Snow fell occasionally, covering the devastation with white that quickly turned gray and brown. Men were constantly cold, constantly wet, constantly miserable. But Christmas was coming. And Christmas meant something, especially in 1914. Both sides were Christian countries with strong Christmas traditions. Christmas was about peace, goodwill, family, home. The contrast between the Christmas message and the reality of trench warfare couldn't have been starker. Christmas in early 20th century Europe was deeply meaningful. It wasn't as commercialized as it is now. It was primarily a religious and family holiday. People went to church, families gathered. There were traditional meals, carols, decorations. For soldiers far from home, facing death in miserable conditions, Christmas made them think about what they were missing. In the weeks before Christmas, both sides started receiving packages from home. Care packages with food, warm clothes, cigarettes, letters. The British soldiers got plum puddings and chocolate. The German soldiers got sausages and beer. Princess Mary, the daughter of the British king, had organized a fund to send every British soldier a brass box with cigarettes, tobacco, and a Christmas card. Princess Mary's gift fund raised money from the British public. The brass boxes became treasured possessions. They contained cigarettes, a picture of Princess Mary, and a Christmas card from the royal family. Soldiers kept these boxes for years after the war. The boxes, themselves, even empty, were reminders of home and of the fact that people back in Britain were thinking about them. The Germans received small Christmas trees, Tannenbaums, sent from Germany to the front. These trees were important in German Christmas tradition. Officers thought they'd boost morale. So there were these small evergreen trees being delivered to the front lines to be set up in trenches and dugouts. The Tannenbaum was central to German Christmas. The tradition of decorating evergreen trees at Christmas originated in Germany. Having a Christmas tree in the trenches was a way to bring a piece of home to the front, to maintain some connection to normal life and tradition even in the middle of war. The high command on both sides was aware that Christmas might affect morale and discipline. They worried that soldiers might become too homesick, too reflective. Some officers tried to keep soldiers busy with extra duties. Others simply hoped the day would pass without incident. Senior officers understood that Christmas was emotionally difficult. Homesickness could undermine fighting spirit. Soldiers, thinking about their families, about peace and home, might become less willing to fight. Some commanders tried to distract soldiers with work. Others issued extra rum rations and hoped that would help morale without causing problems. But something unexpected happened. On Christmas Eve, along various sections of the front line, particularly in the British and German sectors in Belgium, soldiers started putting up decorations and singing carols. The German soldiers started it in most accounts. They put up their Christmas trees along the trench parapets, decorated with candles. They started singing German Christmas carols, Stille Nacht, Silent Night, O Tannenbaum. Their voices carried across no man's land to the British trenches. Imagine being a British soldier, standing in a cold, wet trench on Christmas Eve, far from home, surrounded by death and misery. Then you hear singing from the German trenches. Not shouting or taunting, but singing. Christmas carols, songs about peace and hope. It must have been surreal and deeply moving. The British soldiers could hear the singing. At first, they didn't know what to make of it. Were the Germans drunk? Was this some kind of trick? But the singing continued, and it was carols, Christmas songs. Some of the melodies were familiar even if the words were in German. Silent Night was particularly significant because it was known in both languages. The Germans sang Stille Nacht, and the British recognized the melody. It was a shared cultural reference, a bridge between enemies. Both sides knew this song, had sung it in churches and homes, associated it with peace and family. Then the British started singing back. They sang carols in English. Good King Wenceslas, the first Noel, God rest ye, merry gentlemen. The two sides were having a carol singing competition across no man's land, taking turns, sometimes singing the same carol in different languages. There are accounts of soldiers singing together, Germans doing one verse in German and British doing the next verse in English. Both sides applauding each other's performances. It was bizarre and beautiful. Men who'd been shooting at each other were now singing together, sharing something peaceful and human. Officers on both sides were nervous. This wasn't normal. Soldiers weren't supposed to be friendly with the enemy, but it was a Christmas Eve, and what were they going to do? Order their men to stop singing carols. That would be both impossible and deeply unpopular. So many officers pretended not to notice or decided to let it slide for one night. Some officers were moved by the singing themselves. They were young men, too, far from home, missing their families. The carols reminded them of Christmases past, of happier times. Even if they knew fraternization was against regulations, they couldn't bring themselves to stop it on Christmas Eve. Some soldiers started shouting greetings across no man's land. Merry Christmas, Frohe Weihnachten. The calls went back and forth. Some soldiers spoke the other side's language well enough to have basic conversations shouted across the darkness. Britain and Germany had been closely connected before the war. Many Germans had worked in Britain. Some British soldiers had visited Germany. German was taught in British schools. So there were soldiers on both sides who could communicate, at least basically, in the other's language. This made the fraternization easier. As night fell on Christmas Eve, something remarkable started happening in multiple locations. Soldiers began climbing out of their trenches and meeting in no man's land. It started small, just a few brave or curious souls venturing out. But when they weren't shot, others followed. The first men to climb out of the trenches were taking a huge risk. No man's land was called that because it belonged to no one. It was a killing zone, swept by machine gun fire, covered by artillery. Going out there during daylight was suicide. Even at night, it was dangerous. Sentries would shoot at any movement. But on Christmas Eve 1914, some soldiers decided to take the risk. There are accounts from British soldiers describing how Germans appeared on their parapet, holding up a sign that said, "You no shoot, we no shoot." Or Germans shouting, "Tomorrow is Christmas, we not shoot, you not shoot." The message was clear. Let's take a break from killing each other, at least for Christmas. The broken English in these messages is telling. German soldiers trying their best to communicate in a language they didn't speak well, making the effort to reach out to their enemies. The willingness to be vulnerable, to propose peace even if it might be rejected or exploited, took courage. And it worked. In many sectors of the front, an unofficial truce took hold. Soldiers from both sides met in the middle, in no man's land, the place that had been a death trap for months. They shook hands, exchanged gifts, showed each other pictures of their families. No man's land was surreal on Christmas Eve 1914. This space that had been defined by violence and death was suddenly peaceful. Men were walking around freely, talking, laughing. The barbed wire was still there, the shell craters, the remnants of battle. But the killing had stopped. The gifts were simple. Cigarettes, chocolate, buttons off uniforms as souvenirs. The Germans had better alcohol, so they shared beer and schnapps. The British had better tobacco, so they shared cigarettes. It was a barter system between enemies who were suddenly acting like friends. Soldiers would exchange whatever they had. A German might give a British soldier a can of beer and receive a bar of chocolate in return. They'd trade uniform buttons or cap badges as souvenirs. Some exchanged addresses, promising to write after the war. Some took photographs together, Germans and British standing side by side, arms around each other's shoulders. One of the most famous exchanges was when a German soldier gave a British soldier a barrel of beer, and the British soldier gave the German a plum pudding in return. They toasted each other and drank together, celebrating Christmas as friends rather than enemies. This exchange captured something important. Beer and plum pudding were each side's traditional Christmas food. By sharing these with each other, they were sharing their culture, their traditions, their humanity. They were acknowledging that despite being enemies, they had more in common than they'd realized. The language barrier was a challenge, but soldiers found ways to communicate. Some spoke a bit of the other language. Others used gestures and drawings. A few found they had a common language, like French, that both could speak a little. And some just smiled and nodded and shared cigarettes without talking much. Communication through gestures and goodwill was often enough. Soldiers would point to pictures of their families, showing wives and children. The message was clear without words. I have a family too. I'm a person too, not just an enemy soldier. These simple exchanges humanized the enemy in a way that was impossible during combat. There's an account of a German soldier who'd been a barber in London before the war. He'd lived in England for years before returning to Germany when war broke out. He was cutting British soldiers' hair in no man's land, trimming them up for Christmas. Everyone thought this was hilarious and wonderful. This story shows how many people had connections across the lines that would become battle lines. Europe before World War I was interconnected. People traveled, worked in other countries, learned other languages. The war divided people who might have been friends or neighbors in peacetime. What's remarkable is how widespread this was. The Christmas Truce wasn't one incident. It happened independently in dozens of locations along the front, particularly in the Ypres sector where British and German troops faced each other. Each little truce developed organically, without central coordination. Soldiers just decided on their own to stop fighting for a day. The fact that this happened spontaneously in multiple locations shows it wasn't an anomaly or the result of one unusual commander. It was a natural human response to the situation. Given the opportunity, soldiers on both sides chose humanity over continued fighting. This happened again and again along the front, each time initiated by soldiers themselves. By Christmas morning, the truces were in full effect in many areas. Soldiers were walking around no man's land freely, talking, trading, taking pictures. Some were helping to bury bodies that had been lying in no man's land for weeks or months. This was actually one of the main activities during the truce, recovering and burying the dead. No man's land had been too dangerous to venture into for months. Bodies of soldiers killed in previous battles were still out there, in shell craters, tangled in barbed wire. The smell was terrible. Both sides wanted to recover their dead and give them proper burials, but doing so under fire was nearly impossible. Bodies had been lying in no man's land since the fighting started. They'd been there through rain, frost, the start of winter. They were decomposing, being eaten by rats, becoming part of the landscape. For soldiers living in the trenches, these bodies were a constant presence, a constant reminder of mortality. The smell was inescapable. The truce gave them the opportunity. British and German soldiers worked together to identify bodies, figure out which side they were from, and carry them back to their respective trenches for burial. They dug graves and held services. Chaplains from both sides said prayers over the dead. Enemies stood together, heads bowed, honoring fallen soldiers. This must have been a strange and moving experience. These men had been trying to kill each other. Now they were working together to bury their friends, showing respect for each other's dead. It was an acknowledgement of shared humanity, a recognition that all of them were caught up in something terrible. The bodies were often difficult to identify. Uniforms were muddy and torn. Identity tags might be missing. But soldiers from each side would recognize their own uniforms, equipment, even sometimes faces of men they'd known. They'd claim their dead, carry them back, give them proper burials. It was closure, a way to honor the fallen who'd been left out there for weeks. In some places, joint burial services were held. British and German chaplains would say prayers together, one in English and one in German, over a mass grave containing soldiers from both sides. Soldiers would salute as bodies were lowered into the ground, regardless of which uniform the dead wore. These joint services were powerful. Both sides believed in the same God, read from the same Bible. The prayers were the same, just in different languages. Standing together over graves, enemies recognized that death made them equals. Regardless of which side you fought for, you'd end up in the same ground. And then there were the soccer games. This is the part of the Christmas truce that's become most famous, though it's also the part where the facts get murky and legend takes over. According to some accounts, British and German soldiers played soccer in no man's land on Christmas Day 1914. The soccer games definitely happened in some places. Soldiers would kick around a ball, choose sides that mixed British and Germans together, and play informal matches. These weren't organized games with referees and proper goals. They were just guys kicking a ball around, having fun. Soccer was universally popular among soldiers. It was the sport they'd grown up with, played in villages and city streets across Europe. It required minimal equipment, just a ball and some open space. No man's land provided the space and someone provided a ball, and suddenly enemies were playing together. One account describes a game where the ball was a ration tin. Another says they used a rolled-up bundle of rags. At least one account mentions an actual soccer ball, possibly from a care package sent from home. The goals were marked by coats or helmets thrown on the ground. The rules were loose. Nobody kept serious score. The makeshift nature of these games was part of their charm. These weren't proper matches. They were spontaneous, improvised, joyful. Men playing like boys, forgetting about the war for an hour, just enjoying a game. The fact that they were playing on ground where men had recently died made it even more remarkable. The famous story is that Germany beat England 3-2 in a soccer match on Christmas Day, 1914, in no man's land. This has been repeated in books and articles and movies, but historians debate whether this specific game happened, or if it's a combination of several different smaller games that got merged into one legendary match. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. There were definitely soccer games. There might have been one larger, more organized game somewhere that became the basis for the legend, but the details have been embellished over time. That's how legends work. A kernel of truth grows in the telling until it becomes something larger. What's certain is that soccer was played in at least some locations. Photographs exist showing soldiers standing together in no man's land, and several written accounts from soldiers mention kicking a ball around. Whether there was one famous match or several informal games, the image of enemies playing soccer together has become the symbol of the Christmas Truce. The symbolism is powerful. Soccer is about competition, but friendly competition. It's about testing yourself against an opponent, but respecting them. It's about shared rules and fair play. Everything war is not. By playing soccer together, soldiers were rejecting war, at least temporarily, and embracing something better. The games were significant because they represented something beyond just a pause in fighting. They were soldiers from both sides mixing together, competing in a friendly way, acting like normal young men rather than enemies. Soccer was something they all understood and enjoyed. It was normal, human, fun. Everything the war wasn't. Not every sector experienced the truce. In some areas, fighting continued through Christmas. Some units had recently been in heavy combat and had lost too many friends to feel friendly toward the enemy. Some officers actively prevented fraternization, keeping their men in the trenches at gunpoint. Some sections of the front were too far apart for easy communication between trenches. The Christmas truce was most common in areas where the trenches were close together, where British and German soldiers had been facing each other for weeks without major battles. In these sectors, a kind of understanding had developed. Live and let live. Don't shoot during mealtimes, don't target the other side's supply parties. These informal arrangements made a Christmas truce more likely. In areas where fighting had been recent and intense, where casualties had been heavy, soldiers were less inclined to fraternize. Grief and anger made peace harder. If your best friend had been killed last week by a German sniper, you probably weren't interested in sharing chocolate with Germans on Christmas. The French were generally less involved in the Christmas truce than the British and Germans. Part of this was because the French were fighting on their own soil. The Germans had invaded France, occupied French cities and farms. This made it harder for French soldiers to feel friendly toward the enemy. Their country was being occupied. How could they fraternize with the occupiers? French soldiers saw German soldiers as invaders who'd killed French civilians, destroyed French towns, occupied French territory. The personal nature of this made fraternization feel like betrayal. How could you shake hands with someone who might have burned down a French village or killed French women and children? There were some instances of French and German troops having informal truces, but they were rarer and less elaborate than the British-German truces. The French High Command was also more aggressive about preventing fraternization. Any French soldier caught being friendly with Germans would be severely punished. The French military leadership was extremely concerned about morale and fighting spirit. They'd seen how close the Germans had come. To Paris. They knew France couldn't afford to lose, couldn't negotiate, had to fight until victory. Any sign that soldiers were becoming friendly with the enemy was seen as dangerous. The French command cracked down hard on any fraternization. The Russian and Austrian fronts in Eastern Europe had little to no Christmas truce activity. The religious calendar was different. The conditions were different, and the level of hatred between those forces was higher. The Christmas truce was primarily a Western Front phenomenon, and primarily between British and German troops. Eastern Europe had different dynamics. The fighting there was more mobile, less about static trenches. The cultural differences between Russians and Austrians or Germans were greater, and the Orthodox Christmas was celebrated on a different date than Western Christmas. All of this made a Christmas truce less likely, but where it did happen, it was remarkable. For one day, maybe two in some places, the war stopped. Soldiers treated each other like human beings. They shared what little they had, helped each other bury the dead, played games, sang songs. It was a brief moment of humanity in the middle of hell. The officers were generally not happy about this. Junior officers, the lieutenants and captains who lived in the trenches with their men, were often sympathetic or even participated. They understood what their men were going through. Many of them were young guys themselves, not much different from the enlisted men. Some joined in the fraternization. Others looked the other way and pretended not to notice. Junior officers had strong bonds with their men. They lived in the same conditions, faced the same dangers. Many had been promoted from the ranks and had been common soldiers themselves. They understood the desire for a break from the horror, for a moment of normalcy and peace. Some junior officers felt the same way their men did. There are accounts of lieutenants and captains participating in the Christmas truce, shaking hands with German officers, exchanging toasts, even playing in the soccer games. These officers had made the calculation that maintaining their men's morale was more important than strictly following regulations. A day of peace might actually help their units fight better when the war resumed. But the senior officers, the colonels and generals, were alarmed when reports reached them. This wasn't how war was supposed to work. You don't make friends with the enemy. You don't play soccer with people you're supposed to kill. This kind of fraternization was dangerous to military discipline and morale. The concern was that if soldiers saw the enemy as human beings like themselves, they'd be less willing to kill them. War requires a certain amount of dehumanization. You need to see the enemy as other, as enemy, not as someone's brother or son who likes chocolate and misses his family. The Christmas truce broke. That dehumanization, and that made commanders nervous. Military training includes elements designed to dehumanize the enemy. You learn to call them by insulting names, to think of them as less than human, to focus on killing rather than on the person you're killing. This psychological conditioning is necessary to get soldiers to kill other human beings, something that goes against most people's natural instincts. The Christmas truce undid that conditioning. Soldiers who'd met German troops, talked to them, seen pictures of their families, would have a much harder time shooting at them. They'd hesitate, they'd aim high, they might refuse to fight. This was a command nightmare. There was also concern about what this said about soldier morale and commitment to the war. If soldiers were willing to fraternize with the enemy, did that mean they weren't committed to fighting? Were they war-weary already, after just 4 months? Would they fight when ordered to, or would they refuse? The high commands on both sides were worried about the implications. If soldiers could organize an unauthorized truce, what else might they organize? Might they refuse to attack? Might they mutiny? The Christmas truce showed that soldiers had agency, that they could make choices that contradicted orders. This was dangerous from the command perspective. After Christmas, senior commanders on both sides issued strict orders that fraternization was forbidden. Any soldier caught being friendly with the enemy would be punished. Officers were ordered to prevent any repeat of the Christmas truce. If soldiers tried to organize another truce, officers were to stop it by force if necessary. The orders were clear. There would be no repeat of Christmas 1914. The war was to continue. Soldiers were to fight, not make friends. Anyone who disobeyed would face court-martial. Officers who allowed fraternization would be relieved of command. The message from the top was unmistakable. This must never happen again. And the truces did end. On December 26th, or in some places December 27th, the shooting started again. In most cases, there was some warning. Soldiers would shout across that the truce was over, that fighting would resume at a certain time. This gave everyone a chance to get back to their trenches safely. The end of the truce was often formalized. A German officer might shout, "We start shooting again at noon, get to your trenches." Or a British officer might fire 3 shots in the air as a signal that the truce was ending. This allowed everyone to prepare, to say final goodbyes, to get to safety before the killing resumed. There are accounts of soldiers shaking hands one last time, wishing each other luck, saying they hoped they'd survive the war. Then they'd return to their trenches and start shooting at each other again. The brief moment of humanity was over. Back to the business of killing, the return to war must have, psychologically difficult. You'd just spent hours talking to these guys, sharing food and drink, playing soccer, burying the dead together. Now you had to try to kill them. They'd gone from being the enemy to being human beings, and now they had to become the enemy again. Some soldiers found it incredibly difficult to go back to fighting. They'd met the enemy, talked to them, learned their names, seen pictures of their families. How do you shoot at someone after that? Some soldiers deliberately aimed high for days after the truce, unable to make themselves kill someone they'd been friendly with. There are accounts of soldiers who couldn't make themselves fire at the enemy for weeks after the Christmas truce. They'd go through the motions, point their rifles, pull the trigger, but they'd aim above the enemy trenches. They'd satisfy their officers by firing, but they couldn't make themselves actually try to hit anyone. Eventually, either their aim improved, or they were rotated to different sectors where they hadn't fraternized. But the war machine ground on. The high commands made sure there was no repeat truce. In Christmas 1915, orders were issued specifically forbidding any fraternization. Artillery was ordered to fire on Christmas Day to prevent any unauthorized truces. Soldiers who tried to organize truces were arrested and punished. Christmas 1915 was deliberately made miserable to prevent fraternization. Artillery bombardments were scheduled for Christmas Day. Raids and attacks were ordered to keep soldiers busy and hostile. Officers were warned that their careers would suffer if any fraternization occurred in their sectors. The high commands were determined to prevent another Christmas truce. There were small instances of informal truces in later years, usually brief and local. Soldiers would agree not to shoot during mealtimes, or to not fire unless fired upon, but nothing like the widespread, open fraternization of Christmas 1914 happened again. The commands had learned their lesson and weren't going to allow it. Live and let live arrangements continued throughout the war in quiet sectors. Soldiers would develop informal understandings with the enemy across from them. But these were secret, never acknowledged. Certainly never as open and celebratory as the Christmas truce had been. And officers actively worked to prevent them, rotating units frequently to break up any developing arrangements. The Christmas truce has become legendary, and like all legends, it's been romanticized over time. Movies and stories portray it as this perfect moment of peace and brotherhood. The reality was more complicated. Not everyone participated, not all encounters were friendly, and the truce didn't stop the war or change anything long-term. Films like Joyeux Noël dramatized the Christmas truce, adding romance and drama that probably didn't exist. Novels tell stories of individual soldiers transformed by the experience. These artistic interpretations aren't necessarily false, but they simplify and romanticize a complex event. The real Christmas truce was messier, more ambiguous, less perfect than the legend. But it still matters. The Christmas truce shows that even in the middle of a terrible war, human beings can choose humanity over hatred. These soldiers were following orders most of the time, fighting because they were told to. But on Christmas 1914, many of them chose to be human first and soldiers second. The choice to fraternize was meaningful precisely because it was a choice. Soldiers weren't ordered to be friendly with the enemy. They chose it themselves, often against their officers' wishes, certainly against military regulations. They chose humanity when they could have chosen continued violence. It shows the difference between the people fighting wars and the people running them. The soldiers in the trenches didn't hate each other personally. They were just guys caught up in a massive conflict they didn't fully understand and couldn't control. Given the chance, many of them chose peace, even if just for a day. This distinction is important. Wars are declared by politicians, planned by generals, but fought by ordinary people. Those ordinary people often have more in common with each other than with their leaders. The Christmas truce exposed this, showing that soldier had more sympathy for enemy soldiers than either had for their own high commands. The generals and politicians running the war couldn't allow that. They needed the soldiers to fight, to kill, to die when ordered. Friendship with the enemy was dangerous to those objectives, so they stamped it out, made sure it never happened again. They reimposed the necessary fiction that the enemy was fundamentally different, fundamentally other, fundamentally deserving of death. The Christmas truce is also a reminder of what war costs. These soldiers went back to fighting after Christmas. Many of them died in the months and years that followed. Some of the Germans and British who'd played soccer together, who'd shared beer and cigarettes, who'd buried the dead together, later killed each other in battle. The war went on for 4 more years, killing millions. Think about that. Men who'd shaken hands on Christmas might have killed each other at the Somme or Passchendaele. The German who'd given a British soldier a beer might have been shot by that same British soldier 6 months later. Or vice versa. The friendships formed during the truce were erased by 4 more years of mechanized slaughter. There's something deeply tragic about that. A brief glimpse of what could be, of humans treating each other with dignity and kindness, followed by years of mechanized slaughter. The Christmas truce showed that another way was possible, but the forces pushing for war were too strong. The tragedy isn't just that the war continued. It's that it had to continue. The political and economic forces that had started the war weren't satisfied. National pride demanded victory. Economic interests demanded continuation. The logic of total war demanded complete defeat of the enemy. A spontaneous peace between soldiers wasn't enough to overcome these larger forces. Historians debate the significance of the Christmas Truce. Some see it as a beautiful but ultimately meaningless gesture, a brief pause that changed nothing. Others see it as evidence that ordinary people don't want war. The conflict is pushed by leaders and systems rather than by the people doing the fighting. Both views have merit. The Christmas Truce didn't stop the war. It didn't prevent millions of deaths in the years that followed. In that sense, it changed nothing. But it showed that soldiers on both sides were still human, still capable of compassion and decency even after months of brutal warfare. That matters, even if it didn't alter the course of the war. The question is whether symbolic acts matter if they don't have practical consequences. Does it matter that soldiers chose peace for a day if they went back to war the next day? Does a moment of humanity count if it's followed by years of inhumanity? These are philosophical questions without easy answers. The soldiers who participated in the Christmas Truce carried those memories for the rest of their lives. In letters and diaries and interviews decades later, they'd talk about that Christmas. Many called it the most memorable day of the war, more significant than any battle. Some said it was the one bright spot in years of darkness. Veterans would tell their grandchildren about playing soccer with Germans on Christmas. They'd describe the singing, the gift exchanges, the burial services. These memories stayed vivid decades later when other details of the war had faded. The Christmas Truce stood out because it was so different from everything else, because it represented what might have been. Some veterans felt guilt about the Christmas Truce. They'd been friendly with men they later had to kill, or who killed their friends. They wondered if fraternizing had been a betrayal of their fallen comrades. These complicated feelings show how morally ambiguous war is, how difficult it is to maintain clear ideas of right and wrong when you're living through it. Think about what the Christmas Truce represents on a human level. These men were cold, tired, scared, far from home. They'd watched friends die, they'd killed enemy soldiers, they were living in conditions that were barely tolerable. And yet, on Christmas, many of them chose kindness. They reached out to the enemy, shared what little they had, treated each other with respect. The choice to show kindness in those circumstances required real moral courage. It would have been easier to stay in the trenches, to maintain hate and distance, to not risk vulnerability. But thousands of soldiers chose differently. They chose to see their enemies as human beings, to offer friendship despite every reason not to. That takes a certain kind of courage. Not the courage to fight, but the courage to be vulnerable, to extend trust to someone who might betray it. The soldiers who climbed out of their trenches first, who walked into no man's land not knowing if they'd be shot, they were taking a real risk. They chose to believe in the better nature of their enemies. The physical courage required to go over the top in battle is obvious, but it also takes courage to put down your weapon, climb out of your trench, and walk toward the enemy with your hands out in friendship. You're exposing yourself completely, trusting that the other side will respond in kind rather than shooting you. The trust is a form of courage, and most of the time, that faith was rewarded. The truces held. Men who'd been enemies became, if not friends, at least fellow human beings stuck in a terrible situation together. They helped each other, shared with each other, even mourned together as they buried the dead. The fact that the trust was generally honored is significant. Both sides had reason to be suspicious, to expect tricks or betrayal, but the Christmas Truce succeeded because both sides chose to act in good faith. They kept their word. They respected the truce. This shows something positive about human nature, that even in war, most people prefer peace if given the choice. The Christmas Truce also highlights the class divisions in the military. The enlisted men and junior officers who participated in the truces were the ones actually doing the fighting and dying. They were the ones living in the trenches, suffering through the cold and mud and fear. When given a choice, many of them chose humanity. The senior officers who lived in comfort miles behind the lines, who planned offensives from warm headquarters, who saw soldiers as numbers on a map, they were the ones who ordered the truces to end and made sure they never happened again. The people making the decisions about war were insulated from its worst effects. This class dynamic was obvious to soldiers at the time. Junior officers and enlisted men lived together, shared the same dangers, ate the same food, slept in the same muddy holes. They were united by shared suffering. Senior officers lived in requisitioned houses, ate proper meals, slept in beds. They visited the front occasionally but always returned to safety. The disconnect was obvious and bred resentment. This pattern is common in warfare. The people who decide to start wars rarely fight in them. The people who fight rarely have a say in whether wars start or end. The Christmas Truce exposed this disconnect in a particularly clear way. The soldiers wanted peace, at least temporarily. The commanders wanted war to continue. The commanders won. There's also a religious dimension to the Christmas Truce that's worth considering. Both sides were Christian, celebrating the same holiday with similar traditions. The message of Christmas, peace on earth, and goodwill toward men stood in stark contrast to what they were doing the rest of the time. The Christian message is explicitly about peace, love, forgiveness. Jesus taught his followers to love their enemies, to turn the other cheek. The Christmas story itself is about the birth of the Prince of Peace. How do you reconcile this with killing your fellow Christians? The soldiers on both sides must have felt this contradiction. Some soldiers felt this contradiction deeply. How could they celebrate the birth of Christ, the Prince of Peace, while killing each other? The Christmas Truce was perhaps an attempt to resolve that contradiction, at least for one day, to honor the religious significance of Christmas by actually practicing peace. There are accounts of soldiers saying they couldn't kill on Christmas, that it would be wrong, that God wouldn't approve. These religious feelings gave them permission to disobey orders, to fraternize despite regulations. Christmas provided moral justification for choosing peace over continued war. Of course, the churches on both sides had blessed the war effort. Clergy told soldiers that God was on their side, that fighting was righteous and necessary. The religious establishment was complicit in the war. But at the soldier level, on Christmas 1914, many men chose to follow what they saw as the true message of Christianity, rather than what they'd been told by their leaders. The church's role in World War I was deeply problematic. Churches in every nation supported their country's war effort, claiming God was on their side. German clergy said God supported Germany. British clergy said God supported Britain. French clergy said God supported France. They all couldn't be right, but they all said it anyway. This religious nationalism was a betrayal of Christianity's universal message, but it served political purposes, giving the war moral legitimacy, encouraging soldiers to fight, helping populations accept the terrible costs. The Christmas Truce was a rebuke to this militaristic Christianity, a return to the actual teachings of Jesus, even if only for a day. The aftermath of the Christmas Truce was interesting. When soldiers wrote home about it, many letters were censored. The military didn't want the public to know that soldiers were fraternizing with the enemy. It might raise uncomfortable questions about the war itself. If soldiers could be friends with the enemy, why were they fighting? Military censors read all mail from soldiers. Letters that mentioned the Christmas Truce were often blacked out or not delivered. The military wanted to control the narrative about the war. Stories of fraternization didn't fit that narrative. They suggested the enemy wasn't evil, that the war wasn't necessary, that ordinary soldiers wanted peace. But some letters got through, and some newspapers published accounts of the truces. The public reaction was mixed. Some people thought it was wonderful, proof that humanity persisted even in war. Others thought it was shameful, evidence that soldiers weren't committed enough to fighting. The government downplayed the whole thing, neither confirming nor denying the extent of the fraternization. British newspapers that published accounts of the Christmas Truce were sometimes criticized for undermining the war effort. How could they publish stories about British soldiers being friendly with Germans? Didn't they know there was a war on? But other readers found the stories moving and hopeful, evidence that the war hadn't destroyed all decency. In Germany, the Christmas Truce became part of folklore, a story passed down of that one Christmas when the war stopped. In Britain, it was similar. Veterans would tell their children and grandchildren about playing soccer with the Germans on Christmas. The story took on a life of its own, growing in the telling, becoming more elaborate and legendary. The story was passed down in families and communities. Children who grew up hearing about the Christmas Truce from their fathers or grandfathers would tell their own children. The story became part of family history, a point of pride. My grandfather played soccer with the Germans on Christmas 1914. This became a treasured memory, proof that their ancestor had been part of something special. Today, the Christmas Truce is remembered as one of the most human moments of World War I. There are monuments commemorating it. The soccer match, whether it happened exactly as described or not, has been reenacted and celebrated. Books and movies tell the story. It's become a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest times, people can choose kindness. In Flanders, where much of the Christmas Truce, occurred, there are memorials and museums that tell the story. Every Christmas, ceremonies are held to remember the truce. Soccer matches are played to commemorate the original games. The Christmas Truce has become part of how World War I is remembered, a counterpoint to the stories of horror and slaughter. But we shouldn't let the legend obscure the reality. The Christmas Truce didn't stop the war. The soldiers who participated went back to killing each other. The war ground on for 4 more years, becoming even more brutal and mechanized. Millions died. The brief moment of humanity on Christmas 1914 didn't prevent any of that. The war after Christmas 1914 got worse, not better. 1915 brought poison gas attacks. 1916 brought the Somme and Verdun, battles with over 1 million casualties each. 1917 brought Passchendaele, where men drowned in mud. 1918 brought the Spanish flu that killed millions more. The Christmas Truce was a brief light in a darkness that lasted 4 more years and claimed millions more lives. So, what's the lesson? Maybe it's that humanity is always there, even in the worst circumstances, waiting for a chance to emerge. Maybe it's that wars are fought by ordinary people who often have more in common with each other than with the leaders sending them to fight. Maybe it's that peace is always possible if people choose it, but forces larger than individuals often prevent that choice. The lesson might be about agency. Soldiers are often portrayed as powerless, just following orders, caught up in events beyond their control. The Christmas Truce shows that soldiers have choices. They can choose to be human, to show kindness, to refuse to kill, at least temporarily. The consequences of those choices might be severe, but the choices exist. Or maybe the lesson is simpler. That on one Christmas in the middle of a terrible war, thousands of soldiers chose to be human beings first and soldiers second. They treated each other with kindness and respect. They helped each other, they played together, and then they went back to war because that's what they were ordered to do. The simplest lesson might be the most important. In the worst circumstances imaginable, humans chose kindness. Not because they were ordered to, not because it benefited them, but because they recognized their shared humanity and acted on it. That choice, even if temporary, even if it didn't change the larger outcome, matters. The Christmas Truce is a true story that sounds impossible. Enemies playing soccer in no man's land. Soldiers from both sides singing carols together. Germans and British helping each other bury the dead, sharing food and drink, exchanging gifts. It sounds like propaganda or fiction, but it really happened, and that's what makes it matter. In the middle of one of the most destructive wars in human history, thousands of ordinary soldiers decided the war could wait for a day, and they climbed out of their trenches, walked across ground where men had died, and treated their enemies like human beings. For one brief moment, they chose peace. The Christmas Truce proves that even the most improbable stories can be true. Even in the middle of war, peace is possible. Even when authorities forbid it, ordinary people can choose humanity. Even when everything pushes toward violence, individuals can decide differently. It didn't last. It couldn't last. The war was too big, the forces pushing it forward too strong. But it happened, and a century later we still remember it. We remember it because it shows us something important about human nature, that even in the worst circumstances, even when we're told to hate and kill, many of us will choose compassion if given the chance. We remember because we need to believe that humanity can survive anything, that decency persists even in the face of horror, that individuals matter even when caught up in massive historical forces. The Christmas Truce gives us that hope. It's proof that another way is possible, even if just for a moment. The Christmas Truce of 1914 was humanity breaking through in the middle of hell. It was soldiers refusing to be nothing but soldiers, insisting on their humanity even in the face of orders and military discipline and the logic of war. It was a brief, shining moment that reminds us what we're capable of when we choose to see each other as human beings rather than as enemies. The legacy of the Christmas Truce is complicated. It didn't change the war. It didn't prevent deaths. It didn't lead to peace. But it showed what was possible. It proved that even in the middle of mechanized warfare, individual humans could make different choices. That legacy matters, even if it's just symbolic. Think about the soldiers who participated. Most of them eventually died in the war or came home damaged physically and psychologically. The Christmas Truce was probably the happiest day of their war. Maybe the last truly good day some of them experienced. For those who survived, it was a cherished memory, something beautiful in a sea of horror. For soldiers who died in 1915 or 1916 or 1917 or 1918, the Christmas Truce might have been their last experience of peace, their last moment of treating and being treated as a human being rather than a weapon. That makes it even more poignant. For some, it was literally the last good thing they experienced before they died. The soldiers who survived and went home carried the memory of the Christmas Truce with them. When they struggled with trauma and grief and survivor's guilt, they could remember that one day when things were different. When they felt that the war had destroyed all goodness, they could remember Christmas 1914. It was a light in the darkness, a reason to believe that humanity hadn't been completely lost. In a broader sense, the Christmas Truce tells us something about war itself. War is presented as inevitable, as the natural state when nations conflict. But the Christmas Truce shows that war requires constant effort to maintain. Soldiers naturally drift toward humanity, toward peace. It takes officers and orders and discipline and punishment to keep them fighting. War is the unnatural state that must be imposed from above. This is a radical idea. We're taught that war is an inevitable part of human nature, that people naturally fight when they have conflicts. But the Christmas Truce suggests otherwise. Given the choice, soldiers chose peace. They had to be ordered back to war, threatened with punishment, kept under strict control to prevent more truces. This suggests that peace is actually the natural state and war is the aberration. If that's true, then wars persist not because humans naturally want to fight, but because systems and leaders push them to. The Christmas Truce happened when soldiers escaped those systems briefly. It ended when the systems reasserted control. This interpretation has profound implications for how we think about war and peace. The Christmas Truce also speaks to the power of small acts of humanity. These soldiers couldn't stop the war. They couldn't change policy or negotiate peace, but they could choose for one day to treat each other with kindness. That small choice, multiplied across thousands of soldiers, created something beautiful and memorable. We often feel powerless in the face of large problems. Wars, injustice, suffering seem too big for individual action to matter. The Christmas Truce suggests otherwise. Individual choices do matter. Small acts of humanity can create moments of light even in the darkest circumstances. The soldiers in 1914 couldn't end the war, but they could choose peace for a day, and that choice still resonates a century later. The story of the Christmas Truce endures because it gives us hope. It shows that humans are capable of goodness even in the worst circumstances. It proves that enemies can become friends, that peace is always an option, that individual choices matter. These are messages we need, especially in dark times. Every Christmas, people remember the Christmas Truce. They tell the story, they honor the soldiers who participated, they reflect on what it means. The story has become a Christmas tradition itself, a reminder of what the holiday is supposed to represent. Peace on earth, goodwill toward all. The Christmas Truce made those words real, even if just for a moment. So when you hear about the Christmas Truce, remember it as more than a feel-good story. Remember it as evidence of human capacity for compassion. Remember it as proof that peace is possible if we choose it. Remember it as a rebuke to the forces that push us toward conflict. And remember the soldiers who chose humanity over hatred, who climbed out of their trenches and extended their hands to their enemies. The Christmas Truce of 1914 was a moment when the war stopped, when soldiers on both sides chose to be human, when peace broke out in the middle of war. It didn't last, but it happened. And that matters. It matters because it shows us who we can be, even in the worst of times. It matters because it reminds us that we always have choices, even when it seems we don't. It matters because it's true. On Christmas Day 1914, in the middle of a war that would kill millions, soldiers from both sides met in no man's land. They sang together, played together, buried their dead together. They chose peace when everything around them was pushing toward war. They chose humanity when it would have been easier to choose hatred. They chose kindness when they could have chosen violence. That choice echoes across the century. It reminds us that another way is always possible. That peace doesn't require grand gestures or political agreements. Sometimes it just requires ordinary people deciding to be decent to each other. That wars are fought by human beings who, given the chance, often choose to be human first and soldiers second. The Christmas Truce was humanity in the middle of hell. Brief, imperfect, ultimately unable to stop the war, but real, powerful, and still meaningful a century later. It's a story we need to remember and tell, not because it changed the war's outcome, but because it reminds us what we're capable of when we choose compassion over conflict. Subscribe to learn more untold stories from history.